Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my 2022 garden favorites. If you've not already, be sure to check out part 1. I do a little more explaining in that video of like where I'm growing, how I'm growing, varietal differences, the differences in specific growing areas. But today I'm going to jump right into my favorite vegetable, herb, and annual flower varieties from my 2022 Ohio garden. Kicking it off with the quintessential summertime crop. I had a lot of fun growing watermelon this year. And the latter part of my summer here was hot and dry, the perfect weather for great tasting watermelon. The very first watermelon to ripen in the garden this summer was Lemon Drop. Now, I normally resist the urge to let the fantastic marketing of Baker Creek lure me in, but they got me this year. I just had to try this all yellow watermelon. And I was pleasantly surprised with the results. I've had some issues in the past with things having poor germination and off types, but I really had no issues with this melon, other than it was quite a bit larger than the description in the catalog. They described it as being a 1 to 2 pound personal melon. Mine were double to triple that size, but they were thoroughly and gorgeously golden through and through, which is really the reason that I wanted to grow this watermelon. Now, I wasn't expecting it, but the plants of Lemon Drop were also mottled with yellow coloration. At first, I was a little scared. I thought I had some kind of disease going on in my watermelon patch, but it's just a trait of the specific variety. So if you grow this one, just be aware of that. I liked that the plants of this one were quite compact. I was able to grow this in the fairly tight rows in the back of my garden and trellis the plants up just a small teepee trellis, which worked really well. What I noticed is I had to keep a very close eye on these when it got close to maturity. Lemon Drop has a very thin rind and it's a very, very juicy watermelon. Great eating traits, but this also leads this watermelon to being prone to cracking. So I really had to get out there and check every day to make sure these weren't splitting open on the vine. But picked at peak ripe, these were great. Sweet, succulent, juicy, and early ripening. That in combination with that unique color made this one a winner in my garden this year. Now, if this one was a winner for the earliness and the unique color, the award for the absolute best eating quality would go to Sugar Punch. Now, this variety was quite a bit later ripening in my garden, which when it comes to things like watermelon can always be a bit of a crapshoot here. My season is plenty long enough for an 80 or 90 or 100 day watermelon, but I'm always in a race against the pest and diseases, which seem to become exponentially worse the later I get into the summer season. So I'm often better off with an earlier ripening watermelon. But for a late melon, Sugar Punch did beautifully in my garden. Now, this one was more of a full, vigorous vine, so definitely spread out, but put on a ton of watermelon. And this one is an icebox type, or if you're familiar with the old variety Sugar Baby, it looks very similar to that. So you're gonna get about an 8-pound cannonball looking fruit, very round, a solid dark green black rind, and bright red interior flesh. But Sugar Punch excelled in the eating quality. Now, let me preface this by saying I am a texture fanatic. For me, when judging eating quality, texture is as important, if not more important to me than the actual flavor. And with watermelon, texture can make or break a great melon. My ideal watermelon has a very crisp, fine-grained flesh, and any hint of mealiness or mushiness is gonna just ruin it for me. And Sugar Punch delivered on that texture. It had a really nice, crisp texture, no hint of mealiness whatsoever, but it was also fantastically flavored. Now, this variety can average around a 13% Brix, which, to give you a reference, usually anything at 9 or higher is considered very sweet. So sugar levels are exceptional on this melon, and just overall great taste. And the final watermelon I grew in the garden this year really embodied the best of both of these worlds, the earliness and the eating quality. And this variety was August Ambrosia. While not quite as early as Lemon Drop, it still clocked in at just about 80 days, which is great for people even with a little bit shorter season. And it had great eating quality. I didn't find the texture quite as ideal as with the Sugar Punch, but still a really nice crisp texture and very, very sweet and juicy. Now, I didn't get to test it out this year, but according to Fruition Seeds, August Ambrosia is great for cooler, shorter seasons, which are typically places that are challenging to get a good watermelon to grow. Now, the breeding story of this variety is quite fun also. Now, I tend to geek out on this stuff, so I won't get into all the details, but suffice to say that Fruition Seeds collaborated with renowned plant breeder Dr. Michael Mazurek from Cornell University to breed what they are calling a Finger Lakes heirloom of tomorrow. So Fruition Seeds is located up in the Finger Lakes area of New York. But I really liked that concept of developing heirlooms for tomorrow. But if you're interested in more detail about the breeding story behind this watermelon, I've linked that article in the video description below, so you can check that out. And next, I had to have a favorite pepper this year. I tend to grow quite a few peppers every year and usually end up with some interesting favorites. This year was no different. So the winner this year was a variety called Prism, and this one is a midi bell. So the fruit get about 2.5 inches to 3 inches wide by about 1.5 inches to 2.5 inches tall. They are sweet and crisp and thick-walled and juicy, great for snacking on, great for grilling, great for stuffing if you want to make little hors d'oeuvres with them. Really a wide variety of culinary uses with this one. But what I found most charming about this variety was the color changing effect. So Prism has quite a long ripening window. So you're getting fruit of all different levels of maturity on the same plant. And within those different levels of maturity, you're getting this color change effect where the youngest unripe fruit kind of is a creamy, limey yellow color, changing to a more vibrant lime green to almost a lemon lime green. And then it goes from orange to red orange to a really vibrant red color at full maturity. And at any given time, I was able to pick several peppers of all the different colors from these plants. If I wanted like a nice mix for a salad or a nice mix for a snack tray, I could have all these colors off of one plant versus planting several different plants with different colored peppers on them. Now, I've got plenty of room, but I'm envisioning this for folks that don't have a lot of room in their gardens but want to have a nice array of colored peppers. This would be a great option. And they are tasty at all stages of ripeness. Sometimes with green bell peppers, I find that they've got a slightly off-putting, like grassy flavor, and I did not notice that with Prism at all. Up next, another summertime favorite. This is the only variety that I will mention in these favorites videos that I did not actually grow in my garden this year. I got to see Bolt sweet corn at trials in upper state New York this year and was so impressed by it that I wanted to share it right away with you. Now, I will be growing it out in the garden this coming summer, but after seeing it in New York and hearing about the trial results from the trials near Champaign, Illinois, and in areas of Wisconsin, I'm fully confident that this one will do well in my little corner of Ohio as well. What impressed me so much about Bolt was that for such an early ripening sweet corn, this one's considered a first early in industry terms, clocking in at about a 67-day maturity. Now compare that to your typical mid-season sweet corn, which is right around 75 days. But for such an early ripening corn, it still had exceptional eating quality. Now, typically when breeders are developing early maturing varieties of corn, they are sacrificing eating quality to get that early maturity. So most of your super earlies are just not going to taste as good as your mid or your late season sweet corns. This was not the case with Bolt. This is one of the best eating corns that I've had. I certainly would not have been able to tell in a blind taste test that it was a super early variety. And it's got a nice healthy plant and ear cover as well. So really good husk coverage, which sometimes again you don't get in a super early corn, but those nice tight husks will help to keep pests like those corn earworms out, and even things like birds that want to get in there and peck at the ears of the corn, or opportunistic pests like sap beetles. So I like having a corn with a really nice tight husk over the ear. Now, having such a great quality and early ripening sweet corn is really exciting and has a lot of potential, in particular for those folks that have very short warm season growing regions. This may allow you to get a crop of really great eating corn off in your area, but this is exciting for me in my region as well. Now I've got a plenty long enough growing season to do any type of sweet corn, but what the short season early maturity will allow me to do is more successfully get in several successive plantings of sweet corn in one growing season. Now a note on this one, I've mostly found that this one is available commercially, so in larger seed quantities, say like 1,000 seeds or more, but I did find packets of seed available for sale online from Home Seed Company. In my opinion, this next veggie just does not get enough love. While it may be a candidate for one of the garden's ugliest vegetables, celeriac has a slightly sweet and nutty celery-like flavor that is incredibly versatile in the kitchen. From being able to be used as an alternative for potatoes or noodles, any of you low carbers out there sick to death of zucchini and cauliflower? Try celeriac. To a tasty addition to a root vegetable hash. I even found a recipe online for schnitzel using celeriac instead of meat. I'm not sure why you would do that, but it's kind of fun to know you can. I really like celeriac because it gives me that nice little hint of celery flavor when I'm making soups and stews, but it stores much better than your typical stalk celery. So it's going to store more like your typical root crop, say like a beet or a carrot or a parsnip or something like that. So I can harvest it, keep that in an opened bag in my crisper drawer in the fridge, and it'll keep for months and months. The catch is that celeriac is not the easiest crop to grow here in Ohio. It does not love hot, dry weather, so some growing seasons can be quite challenging here. That's why I've been impressed with brilliant celeriac. I find that these roots size up really nice. They seem to be more stress tolerant and seem to be in general easier to grow than many of the other celeriac varieties that I've tried here in my gardens. I'm only mentioning this next variety because it's just so darn impressive. Are there other winter squash with better eating quality? Yes. But are there other winter squash that grow to 50 pounds and look like giant pink worms in your garden? No. If you are looking for sheer mass of winter squash quantity, I don't think you can beat jumbo pink banana winter squash. And the eating quality is fine. I found that straight out of the oven, the flesh was a little watery, a little lacking in flavor, but once I strained off some of that liquid and used it in baked goods, I had no complaints at all. But this was one of those garden crops that every single person that visited the garden had to stop and question. First of all, they're just so strange looking with that kind of peachy, pinky rind color that jumbo pink banana has. And then the size. Now mine didn't reach the 50-pound mark that this variety has the potential for, but they were still huge. In fact, I think 2 of these squash could easily feed my entire family all winter. And for being such a large squash, they actually ripened relatively early in the garden as well. But like I said, there are other varieties that I prefer just purely in terms of eating quality, but if yield and production is one of your top priorities, I would seriously consider this variety. So I'm sure that many of you are asking, well, what do you recommend for tops in eating quality for winter squash? And the first one I will recommend is a variety called Kai Kai. This is from a similar breeding line as the On winter squash that I recommended in a video last year or the year before. A lot of people asked about that one, and sadly it was never released commercially. But Kai Kai has been released, is available, and is very similar in terms of eating quality. So I cannot express how much I love this squash. First of all, it's beautiful. These are kind of flattened, deeply ribbed, look almost like an ornamental. They have a really deep, rich, bronzy orange flesh. And when baked, that flesh is really dense and rich and absolutely stringless. Now it's a little bit drier than something like a pie pumpkin or a butternut squash, but still really, really nice. And this one is well suited both to savory dishes and to sweet. I've used it both ways and it never disappoints me. The plants are very productive, and in my garden at least, it seemed like the typical pests that I have problems with squash and with pumpkins didn't seem to favor this. So I really had no no issues with squash vine borers. I didn't find as many squash beetles on this one. I don't know why that is, but I know that I had 10 plus different varieties of pumpkin and winter squash planted this year, and they definitely did not favor kai kai. I also like that these squash do a bit of a color change when they're ripe, so you really know when they're ready to be picked. So these have kind of light greenish speckles on them that when these fruit reach maturity will turn to kind of a buff tan. The entire fruit will actually also get a kind of frost over it. So it's pretty easy to tell when these are ready to be picked. And another flavor favorite winter squash for me is honey nut butternut squash. Now, this is a repeat for me. I grow this one nearly every year, and I grew it again this year. But if you are looking for pure, delicious sweetness with smooth, silky texture, I don't think you can beat honey nut. These little personal sized butternut squash are just the perfect size to split in half, and they truly make a dessert with very little added. I like to bake mine with a little butter, cinnamon, maybe some pecans, and man, are they good. It's like a ready-made pumpkin pie almost. And like other butternut types, these don't tend to be as appealing to the squash vine borers, which is always nice here in this area. Now there's several other varieties out there that are very, very similar to honey nut, and I've grown them all in different years and been pleased with all of them. And that includes honey patch squash and the butter baby squash. But I've never had an opportunity to grow all three of these together. So I'm very curious if anyone out there has ever grown honey nut, butter baby, and or honey patch together in the same year. I'd love to hear your opinion if one of them is clearly better than the others. And a final veggie that's shown this year in the less than ideal growing conditions that we had here in Ohio was Leningrad garlic. This hardneck variety produced big, beautiful cloves with nice chunky bulbs that were surprisingly easy to peel. It's doing really well in storage for me right now, and I fully expect this one to hold out at least until early March for me. Flavor-wise, Leningrad tends to be very pungent at first, but quickly mellows out. I really like it for adding some punch to things like salad dressing vinaigrettes or for making homemade garlic butter. And now I wanted to mention a few of the annual flowers from seed that did well in the gardens this year. Now, my favorite flowers tend to be self-sowing, easy to grow annuals that take little to no care on my part, and also ideally provide fodder for pollinators. Bachelor's buttons, sometimes known as cornflowers, tick off all of this criteria, as well as being quite cold hardy, blooming before many of my other flowers in the garden. Now, bachelor's buttons are nothing new. This is a common, old-fashioned kind of cottage garden flower, but my issue with them had always been that I didn't love the colors. I often would grow a mix that tended to be white and kind of baby pink and like a washed out blue. They also can tend to look kind of rangy or weedy looking. They get kind of tall and scraggly. They get knocked over by spring and summer storms, and by the end of the season, they just don't look that great. But I grew blue diadem bachelor's button this year and was really pleased with this variety. So although this plant grows to 2 to 3 feet tall, it seems to have a stockier bearing than many of the old bachelor's buttons. So it held up well to high winds. It didn't topple at the first summer storm. But my favorite thing was this color. This is not a washed out, boring blue. Blue diadem had an intense, deep azure color that barely faded at all as the flowers aged. The bloom size tended to be a little bigger than the typical bachelor buttons as well. And just like my regular bachelor buttons, the bees loved this one. This is a plant that they were constantly foraging on in the early spring. Now, another showstopper in terms of color was the Uproar Rose Zinnia. Now, this is not typically a color that I gravitate toward, and I will say that pictures do not do this variety justice. The vibrant magenta of these 5-inch blooms just glows in the garden. And these big tall plants are simply loaded with blooms. Now, like the bachelor button, I noticed that these plants tended to be better at staying upright in the summer storms. They have very thick stalks. They are tall, they're a cutting flower type, but they don't tend to flop over as easily as some of my other tall zinnias. The other thing that I noticed is the Uproar Rose does not seem to succumb to powdery mildew as quickly quickly as many of the other varieties of tall cutting zinnias, which is really nice. Now, like all zinnias, butterflies tend to love this one, and it will just bloom and bloom and bloom pretty much from midsummer up until that first frost. Now, another old-fashioned cottage/cutting garden type flower that I loved in the garden this year was Color Fountain's Cleome. Now, Cleome used to be quite popular, but it seems to have fallen out of fashion, and I'm guessing that's because of maybe the height and the fact that some of the older varieties like Color Fountains tend to have small thorns on them. But I absolutely loved them, and the hummingbirds did too. Now, Cleome has a really unique flower form, which is why it has the nickname spider flower. And Color Fountains comes in a mix of white, rosy pink, and kind of a fuchsia purple. Now, these did grow to be about 5 feet tall, which can be overwhelming in a small space, but they do make an excellent back of the border type plant in the garden. It's just something to keep in mind when you are planning on where to plant these. I've also heard it rumored that deer aren't particularly fond of Cleome. And another oldie but goodie was Swiss Giant's straw flower. Now, I recall straw flowers being all the rage with crafters from my grandma's era. The appeal being that these blooms are everlasting, so they have this dry, straw-like texture, and they virtually never lose their color or their appearance. So you can use them in wreaths and decorations and arrangements, and they will always look beautiful. You can see that here. These are some blooms that my kids pilfered from the garden back in July, and they've just had them sitting in their rooms ever since. And these look virtually identical to the way these blooms looked while they were still out in the garden. These plants are incredibly tough, very heat and drought tolerant once established, and they will bloom right up until the first frost. And even after the frost, these plants are dead. I shot these photos at the end of November, but you can see how vibrant and cheery the blooms still are, which is really nice when there's not much color out in the garden to be had. And a final flower winner for me in the 2022 garden was Wild Petunia. Now, this seems to be a petunia of many names, and I'm sure I will butcher some of these pronunciations, but I'll put the correct spellings up on the screen for reference. This is not Rulia humilis, but rather Petunia violacea, also known as Petunia integrifolia. I've also seen it called violet flower petunia, wild violet petunia, and Laura Bush petunia. As far as I can tell, they're all the same thing. You may be familiar with this type of petunia, but this was new to me. And honestly, for the longest time, I was not a fan of petunias. So there's something about modern bedding petunias. I don't know what it is. I find their growth habit a little unnatural. I'm not a fan of a lot of the bloom colors. And frankly, they're used so often in commercial plantings that I kind of get sick of them. But wild petunia has a totally different habit. It's more wild and sprawling looking. The flower heads are not as big as a modern petunia, but they're plentiful. So these plants are just covered in these about 1 inch to 1.5 inch blooms that are this incredible, intense, like ultraviolet color. Now, the pollinators definitely gravitate toward this one. And what I was pleasantly surprised with was the scent. So this is one of those flowers that if you stand right up in the blooms and sniff, you don't smell a whole lot, but I'd be out in the garden and I'd just catch a whiff of this subtly sweet, spicy scent that would just kind of float on the breeze, and figured out it was coming from these petunias. And I really, really enjoy flowers that do that. And this was yet another plant that took virtually no care. I didn't deadhead. Honestly, I didn't water them. I didn't do anything for them, and they just continued to reward me with blooms all the way up until the frost. So this is one I will probably plant every single year from now on. So that wraps up my 2022 favorites from my Ohio garden. Be sure to check out the first video as well. And if you've not already, check out my 2021 garden favorites. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.